Forget the promise of progress and understanding, for in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there is only war. And, in my fistful of years in the hobby, countless topics to dive into. This is not an introduction to the setting of 40k, though we will go over a lot of elementary topics at the top of this iceberg, so I'm assuming some knowledge going forward. In case you don't know the drill already, we start with well-known subjects, and as we go along, the subjects get more obscure, although, unlike some icebergs, not necessarily more disturbing, with the subjects in this instance being 40k related, so there are locations, mysteries, real people, books, games, and a lot of theories. This iceberg is cobbled together from other icebergs linked in the description alongside my own amalgamation of them, which adds like 10 to 15% more entries. And since we're talking 40k, shit is gonna get very weird and maybe very ugly. Got it? Hell yeah. Awesome. Let's get started. Let's get started with the commoner's knowledge, which you might have heard through the vine even if you've never considered yourself a fan. For most, I honestly recommend skipping this dribble, but I want to be thorough. They are my bulwark against the terror. They are the defenders of humanity. They are my Space Marines, and they shall know no fear. The Space Marines, or Adeptus Astartes, are the poster boys of 40k. Here's a damn statue of one outside the Grapevine Citadel I visit every now and then. In Darktide, even bigger statues have been built in their honor. A Space Marine is an 8-foot-tall soldier, built out of a metric ton of muscle and ceramite, often armed with bolters and chainswords supported by a transhuman physiology that features an additional 22 organs. They are also strong enough to swipe a man's head off way faster than they have any business of being, given almost unparalleled tactical training, and hold devotion that will drive them to the absolute extremes in defending the Imperium. After some trials and operations that will kill a majority of the child or adolescent participants, the resulting warrior is ready to face the Imperium's greatest threats or purge rebellious populations. They also come from roughly 1,000 chapters, composed of, at most, with exceptions, 1,000 Space Marines, each with their own cultures and doctrines of battle. Two chapters I have to mention real quick are the Death Watch, composed of veterans from other chapters and committed to fight aliens, and the Grey Knights, composed entirely of psychics and committed to fighting demons and their most dangerous allies. Is 1 million Space Marines too few for an entire galaxy? Probably, but even a few squadrons can save a vital world or change the course of a war. And they also have the biggest range of models and tend to come in every starter set for 40k. To be a man in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. That's a quote you'll probably see at the beginning of your core books, and it's certainly an apt quote for the Imperium. Crawling from the ashes of near extinction twice, humanity has been subjected to a theocratic fascist regime that often extols the virtues of zealotry, submission, ignorance, and hatred. Living in the Imperium most often means working more than you'd like, sleeping less than you'd like, getting yelled at by your priests and or your boss, steering clear from gangs or getting turned into a servitor, and dying in a workplace-related accident. Some love this and embrace the zealotry, some hate this and align themselves with gangs or even heretical cults. Some are just trying to survive and join militias, or will become the boot and join the enforcers. And some are plucked from the populace to join the local planetary defense force, or even the Imperial Guard, where swarms of thousands or millions of troops face the external threats to the Imperium. Said Imperial Guard, or Astra Militarum, can be played on the tabletop, but as for the Imperium, unless you're amongst the nobility or live in a paradise world, it's gonna suck around here. The difference between gods and demons largely depends on where one is standing at the time. The galaxy has been plagued by an ancient evil lying beneath the veil of the material. 4 gods, with their legions in tow, have been clawing at our universe, and when they tear through, cosmic horrors are unleashed. They don't conform to biology, physics, or your pleas for mercy. Depending on the demon, they might not even conform to your pleas of death. They are receptive to worship, as it's a source of power, so they have plenty of followers ranging from lowly humans who thought, or were fooled into thinking, that serving space hell was better than serving the Imperium, to Space Marines who thirsted for power beyond the structures of the Imperium. The demons, and many followers of Chaos, are divided into 4 major gods, which are Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh. This is a sci-fi setting, and a big trope of that genre is aliens, or as they're called in 40k, Xenos. Old war campaigns from the Imperium's early days have wiped out most aliens smarter than a whale, which has left behind the strongest or most tenacious. There are plenty of species that are holding their ground, and some have found some standing with the Imperium. But for the ones on the tabletop, there are the Eldari, their evil edgy twins the Drukhari, Tyranids, their Genestealer cult servants, Orcs, Necrons, the Tau Empire, and Leagues of Votann. The Genestealer cults are mutated humans and the Leagues of Votann descend from humans, but the cults serve aliens and the Leagues of Votann don't serve the Imperium without a price. The Ultramarines were the 13th Legion and currently one of the top chapters ruling the Ultramar subsector. They have a big Greco-Roman theme and are often characterized with a by-the-books attitude, exemplified by their adherence to the Codex Astartes, which is a big book that outlines what Space Marines should be on the battlefield. They're also prolific with the blue painted Marines being almost default in marketing, and their biggest character, Roboute Guilliman, being the current head of the Imperium. They also get a bit of hate for overshadowing other chapters significantly, and a certain writer's notorious association with the faction, but personally, they're at worst kind of vanilla. Lastly, the name of the chapter is a reference to the Ultramarine shade of blue, which they don't quite have, but whatever.
I will see the galaxy freed once more. And if I cannot save it from your failure, Father, then let the galaxy burn.
The age of knowledge and enlightenment has ended. The age of darkness has begun. Absolutely the most important war in 40k for understanding the setting. The Horus Heresy is recounted over 54 books in the Horus Heresy series, 13 books in the Siege of Terra series, 21 books in the Primarch series, 12 campaign books, 9 short stories, 55 audio dramas, 4 character novels, 24 novellas, 102 short stories, and a musical in the year 2052, with more to come. It sets up the Loyalist and Traitor Marines, and their most influential characters, as a fucked up game of telephone and a few devious bastards plot the downfall of the Imperium in the name of chaos. In the end, Horus dies, the Emperor gets put on the Golden Throne, and the Loyalist Primarchs are separated from their legions. 10th edition is the current version of the 40k tabletop war game, and a lot of us probably have 9th edition on our minds. 10th edition brings the removal of the Psychic Phase, relics and warlord traits becoming enhancements, sub-factions becoming detachments, reworked detachments. A lot of armies got a lot more simple, and the Combat Patrol game mode. Not many armies have their codexes yet, but it's currently doing alright, though I have been missing some of the depth the armies used to have. Part early God of War and part Gears of War, Space Marine is a video game released in 2011 by Relic Entertainment that followed Ultramarine Captain Titus and co. as the Forge World of Gaia is under attack by orcs and later Chaos Marines. There's also some multiplayer components with deathmatch modes, a horde mode, and a mode that allows players to play as a Dreadnought or Hellbrute. It did alright in the reviews and got a nice cult following as a sort of definitive Space Marine experience. I played it myself and enjoyed most of it, as once the orc fit is gone, the game gets a lot less interesting. In the 2011 Game Awards show, a sequel by Saber Interactive was unveiled that pits Titus against Tyrannus from the Fourth Tyrannic War and the Thousand Suns, with it being released on September 9th, 2024. At the time of recording, that's 9 days away, and it looks really good so far, but I haven't played it yet. I'll add something real quick here, depending on how I feel about it. Okay, so my conclusion is that this game rocks. Blood for the Blood God, often with the side of Skull for the Skull Throne, is a common war cry for the Thirds of Khorne. Use of the quote is common in early 40k memes, and I know I've heard this quote like 8 years ago in an SCP thing long before I got into 40k. Holy Terra is humanity's homeworld and the highly defended capital world of the Imperium, home to the Emperor and the Imperial Palace alongside the Super Space Marines, the Adeptus Custodes. It's also an extremely overpopulated hive world, and because the Emperor is here, it's a pretty popular place for pilgrimages. As for its functions as a capital, powerful groups of the Imperium, such as the Adeptus Terra, Ecclesiarchy, Adeptus Arbites, Imperial Navy, Officios Assassinorum, and Astra Telepathica have their headquarters here. The High Lords of Terra are also based here, of course. Much like the Imperium, it's kind of a miserable shithole, but it's chugging along and absolutely imperative that it keeps chugging along. Dawn of War is a series of 3 real-time strategy games set in the 40k universe, released in 2004, 2009, and 2017, with both single-player and multiplayer modes. While their campaigns feature the Bloodraven Space Marine chapter, the Imperial Guard, Sisters, Chaos Space Marines, Drukhari, Eldar, Orcs, Necrons, Tau, and Tyranids are available in alternate game modes, while Demons make an appearance as a non-playable faction in Dawn of War 3, though several of these factions are behind DLC. Dawn of War has been a pretty common entry point for 40k fans, especially as the first 2 are highly regarded RTS games 40k aside, while the third game was a notorious disappointment. As coined in that one quote in the beginning of the video, Grimdark is often used to describe the tone of 40k, and other settings where amorality, violence, and hopelessness are the norm. While there are a few different definitions for Grimdark, some works I've seen associated with the label are The Road, Game of Thrones, and Berserk. Within 40k, there is always some discussion on why something is the way it is, and the answer often given is Grimdark, with common examples being how humans load the giant cannons on spaceships manually, or just the existence of the Drukhari. There's also discussion of whether something is sufficiently grimdark, especially as some people criticize the Tau, or more recently the Leagues of Votann, for not being grimdark. There are also cases of something being over the top in its grimdarkness, such as the existence of breeding worlds, or an infamous story of sisters being killed by Grey Knights so that they could use their blood to cleanse themselves, which is a story I'll mention elsewhere in the Iceberg. For these situations, you may hear the term grim derp. Forget the power of technology and science, for so much has been forgotten, never to be relearned. The Adeptus Mechanicus is an organization slash faction slash religious order that intersects with the Imperium that's focused on maintaining humanity's technology. While it is technically a part of the Imperium, it is not only probably older than the Imperium, but the culture within is almost completely divergent, with the religion of the Cult Mechanicus and the language of the Cant Mechanicus. These idiosyncrasies are largely tolerated, as they are responsible for the Imperium's continued survival and expansion. Without them, humanity would be pretty aimless on what to do with the technology left behind by their Dark Age ancestors. They also have the responsibility of recovering old technology and enforcing their dogmas, the most infamous of which is cracking down on innovations as they are seen as blasphemous. The Mechanicus also oversees the Imperium's war machines, with the Interior Ordinatus and the Collegia Titanicus, while also keeping tabs on the Imperial Knight Houses. On the infantry scale, there's their private army made of cyborgs and Qatari troopers, backed up by their priests and even a few robots. To also address the small elephants in the room, the Adeptus Mechanicus are also the stars of the Mechanicus turn-based strategy game, released in 2018, which has tech priests exploring a Necron tomb world. The soundtrack, composed by Guillaume David, is loved by many, and is featured here in this video right now. In May 2024, during the Skulls showcase for Warhammer video games, a sequel to Mechanicus was announced, with its release date also to be announced. The Emperor is a former ruler of the Imperium and current deity of the monotheistic Imperial cult. While his origins are shrouded in mystery, what is known for certain is that he emerged over 10,000 years ago on Terra. With the help of his team of immortal nerds, he created super soldiers, conscripted some regular soldiers, and made peace with the Mechanicum to supply them. He then focused all of this on establishing the Imperium, but at the end of the Horus Heresy, he got wounded and placed on the Golden Throne to keep the door to a demonic army shut and the North Star of the Warp active. And though it's now limited because of his condition, the Emperor is an extremely powerful Psyker and has several relics that channel his power, some of which are wielded by his Primarch sons. Also, prior to his incapacitation, he had a very different idea on the ideology of the Imperium, which focused on aggressively secular rationalism, but he's not often in a position to speak. Every now and then he croaks out some words or psychic fire, but for now, he remains on the throne. The Primarchs are the 21 pod-grown sons of the Emperor and his former scientist buddies, Erda and Amara Stardi. Under contested circumstances, the Primarchs were scattered on different worlds, which gives them all different upbringings, but they were unified by being some of the most powerful individuals in the galaxy. While 2 of these Primarchs were lost or more likely killed during the Great Crusade, that left 19 who split in half during the Horus Heresy. The Primarchs were Lionel Johnson, Fulgrim, Perturabo, Jagadai Khan, Lehman Russ, Rogel Doran, Connor Cruz, Sanguinius, Ferris Manus, Ingron, Gilliman, Mortarion, Magnus, Horus Lupercal, Lord Aurelian, Vulcan, Chorus Corax, Alfarius, and Omegon. Terra's next door neighbor is Mars, which is another extremely important world for the Imperium. It is the cradle for the Mechanicus, which has been there since before the establishment of the Imperium, and remains a holy world for followers of the Cult Mechanicus. Its importance comes from its function as a forge world where most of the population carries out the manufacturing of all manner of technology for the Imperium, and this is also where the leader of the Mechanicus, the Fabricator General, can be found. The last little fun fact is that there's all sorts of feared and treacherous regions deep beneath the Holy Planet, such as the Liberius Omnis, that even after millennia still hold secrets from the Mechanica. Exterminatus Extremis is a notorious practice of the Imperium, where a planet is completely purged of all life. This can mean deploying virus bombs, nuclear weapons, torpedoes to destabilize the crust of a planet, or torpedoes to ignite the atmosphere of a planet. Such a procedure is authorized by the Inquisition, and has a high standard to be deemed necessary, such as orc infestations or chaos corruption on planets that are deemed beyond saving or no longer valuable. It's also memed a bit that Exterminatus is executed for bad reasons, which does kind of happen, but there's a lot of comedic exaggeration in the community. An example is the best way to explain it. There's a god of hope, and the god of freaking hope is evil. The Chaos Gods, or Ruinous Powers, are 4 powerful entities that dwell deep within the warp, each encompassing some aspects of existence. Khorne is rage and violence, Nurgle is stagnancy and mortality, Tzeentch is ambition and change, and Slaanesh is excess and perfection. Each of these gods have different armies of unique demons and followers, including devoted legions of Space Marines, which are World Eaters for Khorne, Death Guard for Nurgle, Thousand Sons for Tzeentch, and Emperor's Children for Slaanesh. These gods also really do not like each other, but some rivalries are stronger than others. Nurgle's stagnant growth and decay clashes with Tzeentch's ambition for unpredictable change. The rivalry between Khorne and Slaanesh is a bit harder to define, but I've seen it as Slaanesh being death by 1,000 cuts and Khorne being a decapitating swing. Some more nuances on these Mal deities may pop up as we go on, but for a more in-depth understanding, the name Ruinous Powers is an apt one, as it grasps how these beings operate. For as long as there is war, suffering, and the strive to surpass those things, the Ruinous Powers will be out there in one shape or another. Now that they're here, they do because of what they are. If they did otherwise, they kind of would not be. Existing alongside the material world is the warp, a realm composed of all the non-physical stuff such as emotions and souls. Whatever has life and loses it ends up here, most often getting devoured because the warp has its own weird life forms that don't have any kind of traditional biology. It is also the domain for the Ruinous Powers, their servants, and their realms aptly called the Realms of Chaos. There was a time, eons ago, when it was kind of chill, but the emergence of the Ruinous Powers and countless galactic wars has turned into a violent, voracious hellscape. Humanity discovered it during the Dark Age technology and has studied it, weaponized it, and since it doesn't conform to physical laws, have used it to travel. As a footnote, the Warp and the Realms of Chaos are often used synonymously, but Imperial ships don't go through the throne of Khorne in order to deliver frozen Groxburgers or whatever, they just kind of pass by it. Back to the travel aspect, sometime in the Dark Age of technology, humanity created a device that allows for a ship to create an opening into the warp and protect the system to minimize the threat posed by that dimension. This allowed for faster than light travel, and became humanity's preferred method for executing it. They even created a few tunnels and gates, but those aren't around like they used to be. As for what's still around, the Imperium has a protected group of mutants called Navigators that can focus on the Astronomicon projecting from Terra and use it as a guide for their position in the warp. There are other methods of using the warp as a medium to cross the galactic expanse, such as psychic teleportation or unstable rifts that can either pop up randomly or be opened by the powers of chaos. While Abaddon has waged his 13th Black Crusade since around 3rd edition, at the end of 7th edition with Gathering Stormfall of Cadia, the Crusade now stands out for leading to some major consequences for the rest of the setting. Cadia's destruction led to the creation of the Cicatrix Maledictum and the Imperium Nihilus, giving the armies of Chaos more room to raid real space with impunity. Later in the Gathering Storm series, Guilliman is resurrected by some Eldar witchcraft, and he mobilizes the Indomitus Crusade to reclaim any cut-off Imperial worlds, which goes on to define the Imperium during 8th and 9th edition. I'm skipping over a lot of other details from Gathering Storm, but the victory of Chaos during the 13th Black Crusade and Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade are driving aspects for most factions, and by most factions I mean all Imperial factions, all Chaos factions, Leagues of Votann, and the Eldar. Developed by Fat Shark, who did the Vermintide games for the Warhammer Fantasy setting, Darktide is a co-op FPS game not unlike Left 4 Dead, set on Atoma Prime, where the Inquisition is deploying penal conscripts to quell a massive chaos uprising in the name of Nurgle. Taking the role of an Imperial Guard veteran, Imperial Cold Zealot, Sanctioned Psyker, or Ogryn, teams of 4 enter the hive city of Tertium to complete a variety of missions to get experience and new items to toughen up your operative. This game did have a very rough launch with an unexpected lack of content and an undesirable focus on microtransactions, but free updates have covered for the holes in the gameplay. It's now a fairly respected staple for 40k games. Oh yeah, and about that soundtrack.
Marcel? Where are you going with that disc? You are not putting that on again. Marcel, okay, if you press that button, you are in very, very big trouble.
In line with their football hooligan influence, orcs speak Low Gothic in a strong Cockney accent. Their way of speech turns words like the into da, proper into propa, and so on. There are also other words of their own language that mix in with their Low Gothic, such as crump, which can mean defeat, crush, or kill, and Daka, which refers to firepower. Additionally, orc speech is somewhat translated into other languages, combining aspects of how children speak and some regional dialects that kind of match up with the Cockney accent. In some of the low hive regions, various cults, and most desperate battlefields across the Imperium, cannibalism is a fact of life. This is mostly through corpse starch, which is processed, canned, and distributed by specialized guilds. One of the prominent examples of these guilds is the Corpse Guild of Necromunda, which harvests the dead from accidents and especially gang wars for processing. The corpse starch aspect of the Imperium's cannibalism is often seen as a grim necessity to hold back starvation, but it is practiced elsewhere for other purposes. Cannibalism is also practiced by some death cult assassins and space marines, with the former doing it for rituals of empowerment, and the latter having the ability to gain intelligence from brains they devour through one of their implanted organs. As space marines find themselves in conflict with insurrectionists and heretics, human flesh may be eaten for strategic purposes. The Blood Angels are also a well-known example of cannibal Astartes, as their gene seed curses them with a compulsion to drink blood which, if not maintained, can result in overt cannibalism to quench their thirst for blood. This fault of their gene seed is also reflected on all successor chapters of the Blood Angels. An important note about all of this is that cannibalism is seen as a sin under the Imperial Creed. However, as the Ministorm's grasp fades out in some of the dark corners of the Imperium, and under the special authority of planetary governors and inquisitors, exceptions are made. The Imperial Creed's belief in cannibalism as heresy is not baseless, as it is a source for chaos corruption. Cannibalism to taste something forbidden is in the domain of Slanesh. To erase your enemy or cut up their flesh is the domain of Khorne. To taste the rotting flesh is in the domain of Nurgle. Maybe Tzeentch is open to making cannibalism a step in some elaborate ritual. Regardless, unsanctioned cannibalism, especially through unprocessed flesh, is persecuted as heresy. Released in 5 parts between early 2018 and early 2020, Astartes is a short film by Siama Peterson that follows a squadron of space marines from the Retributors chapter as they strike a small heretic cell. With an edit compiling the 5 parts gaining over 18 million views and 392,000 likes, this film has been praised for its depiction of space marines being in line with what is often told about them, a quote-unquote lore-accurate depiction, and its incredible effects work. Using most of the original materials, the extremely low amount of dialogue and lack of context has spurred plenty of theory crafting, leaving many fans curious as to what, if anything, comes next from Peterson for this film. That whole thing is a discussion in and of itself. Astartes 2 was revealed in 2020, while the first part was released as a product of over 7 years of work, thrown up by a copyright kerfuffle, and talks of Siama being hired by Games Workshop, while still working as a freelancer with his own projects not even related to 40k. It's interesting, complicated, but also doesn't leave a lot of room for enthusiasm. May you walk with fortune, Roboute Guilliman, said Yvain, and know that we shall stand together in battle again, before whatever end befalls us. Civisarch offered an elaborate warrior salute to Guilliman, who nodded curtly in return before the Eldar turned and swept gracefully from the chamber. No doubt we will, murmured the Primarch thoughtfully, watching the enigmatic Xenos withdraw, so long as it serves your needs. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I think it's getting a little hot in here, am I right or am I? That is an excerpt from the one interaction between Yvain and Guilliman. Amongst the most high-profile matters between humans and Eldar, Yvain did some ghost shit on Guilliman, and he's doing better now. This became a pretty easy subject for shipping material, and that's been run with since. There's even a piece of official artwork that, I suppose, adds breadcrumbs to this. The latest Dominatus Dominus of the Adeptus Mechanicus, Belisarius Cawl is one of the highest-ranking officials of the Mechanicus and trusted aide for Roboute Guilliman. After the Horus Heresy, the Primarch met with him to organize the creation of the Primaris Space Marines. In 40k times, Cawl played a key role in the resurrection of Roboute Guilliman, as he created his Armor of Fate to heal him along with the Emperor's Sword. As for the time between 30k and 40k, he did spend those tens of thousands of years on the aforementioned Primaris project, which was mobilized after the fall of Cadia for the Indomitus Crusade. Outside of that, and more recently, he's been researching Blackstone, managing the selective consciousness, and working on his not AI named Cawl Inferior. He's also often accompanied by his pet Space Marine Alpha Primus, who was meant to be the first Primaris Marine and kind of a Frankenstein of every Legion's gene seed, making him extremely powerful for Astartes but in constant pain. If all those hobbies sound a little off for what I've said about the Mechanicus, they think so too, and he's suspected of being heretical to some extent, enough to keep him from being a High Lord. While the term science fantasy has been thrown around to separate your Star Wars from your Star Treks, The phrase fantasy in space refers to how there's some pretty overt parallels between the factions of Warhammer Fantasy and 40k. Imperium and Empire, Imperial Knights and Bretonnians, Orcs and Orcs, Necrons and Tomb Kings, Eldar and Elves, Squad/Leagues of Votann and Dwarfs. Chaos and almost all of the deities are shared as well, such as those of the Eldar and Orcs. Sigmar and the Emperor have their own parallels. The Leagues of Votann have their own ideas of ancestor worship. The Skaven manifests in some ways in 40k, but never as clearly as the others. This has even kind of fed back into fantasy, with Age of Sigmar and the Stormcast Eternals, sharing some aesthetic parallels with the Astartes. Following the tide of boomer shooters post-Dusk, Boltgun is a video game released in 2023 by Auroch Digital that follows a Malum Cato, a Sturmgarde veteran of the Ultramarines since Hagraya, to handle a newly opened warp rift and its invading forces. While there are some critiques of its lack of variety towards the end and repetitiveness, it was generally well received. There were also some interesting adaptations of tabletop elements, such as the strength and toughness matchups. About a year later, the Forges of Corruption DLC was released that added some new levels, weapons, enemies, and a free horde mode. Hive worlds are estimated to comprise between 10 and 25% of the total quantity of Imperial planets. Around the entire Imperium, over 85% of planets have at least one hive city cluster. With humans likely numbering in the quintillions, some worlds have been focused on housing that population and putting them to work. These hive worlds are populated by several hive cities, holding at least billions each, and these cities are structured, with the nobles at the peak, workers in the middle, and a fucking mess at the bottom. The lands between hive cities do sometimes have people, but those areas tend to be mostly inhospitable for one reason or another. There are also some hive worlds that are fully consumed by hives. Due to the population of these hive cities, they struggle to really manage everyone, so most of the time, wars between noble houses and gangs dictate what happens to the people more than imperial administrative groups. There are also all sorts of people in hive cities compared to the hordes of slaves and servitors of forge worlds or hordes of farmers in agri worlds. So there are a lot of stories just following different people across different imperial hives. As the next entry features shoving people back into the womb. Featured in Dead Sky Black Sun by Graham McNeil, the Daemoncula is a process devised by warsmith Hantsu to create chaos space marines for the Iron Wars at an accelerated pace. It's essentially a sort of a literal rebirth, as an adolescent child is placed inside of a female slave that supplies the contained child with nutrients and gene seed. Once it has bursted out of the slave, it is inspected to see if it qualifies as a proper legionary, while the rejects gets run away. If she's still alive, the female slave is used again. This whole process was put to an end by exiled Ultramarine Captain Uriel Ventress, a group of guardsmen, and some of the rejects. Gork and Mork are the gods of the orcs, representing being brutally cunning or cunningly brutal, but some might say brutal yet cunning or cunning yet brutal. Regardless, these two gods may be locked in some kind of eternal battle, but they are deities in the same regard as the ruinous powers, they just play a different game. Most boys look up to Gork and most odd boys look up to Mork, while Gargants are made in the image of these gods. One of the top war bosses, Yazgul Magurk Thraka, claims to be the prophet of Gork and Mork himself, which is a claim that seems to be at least a little true. Some are exclusively devoted enough to think being Gorky is stupid, while others think being Morky is cowardice. These gods can also manifest psychically, as weird boys call for the Fist of Gork to strike down their enemies. While not exclusive to 40k, its tabletop players and collectors have taken up the name Plastic Crack to describe the underlying compulsion to buy more minis. You can find an image in some Warhammer community that will have a caption like "Plastic Crack is real," and the image itself is $200 worth of unpainted minis. That's the kind of shit Plastic Crack is talking about. Henry Cavill was a British actor who's played Superman in a few DC movies, and Geralt in the Netflix TV series adaptation of The Witcher. He's also been pretty open about his love for Warhammer 40k in both the stories and the tabletop game, which got him admiration from some fans that do border on idolizing sometimes, but I suppose some people are just like that. While he's not the only person of status interested in the hobby, in December of 2022, his name was attached to some not yet fully disclosed live-action film project for 40k under Amazon, which, while widely celebrated, we've only heard little peeps of since the announcement. While there's also been plenty of bullshit claims and rumors since that announcement, what I can say for certain is that he loves to collect custodies and enter the deal with Games Workshop with a lot of excitement. You kinda love to see it. In March of 2024, it was announced that Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 would collaborate with the 40k brand to add 3 cosmetic bundles. One was for a Kasrkin or Cadian Stormtrooper, one for the Adeptus Sororitas, and another for an Ultramarine or Blood Angel Scout. These cosmetic packs also came with a unique knife and a chainsword. What stuck with people the most from all of this was that the Space Marine Scout with sunglasses was a truly strange sight to behold that made rounds across the community. There was also some things actually do kind of just leave you speechless, you know? On June 4th, 2020, a statement was released in the official Warhammer Twitter account condemning quote-unquote prejudice, hatred, and abuse in the hobby, and saying that they would continue to extend the range of representation within their IPs. A similar statement, more focused on 40k, was put out on November 19, 2021, titled "The Imperium is driven by hate, Warhammer is not." The statement condemns those who co-opt the Imperium's imagery for use in political extremism, or otherwise genuinely admire the Imperium, as a few days prior to the statement, a major tournament in Spain had a very open neo-Nazi amongst its participants. I'll get to the worst of this shit later, but these official statements come up occasionally in discussion and explain the behaviors of some guys in the hobby, including some particularly prominent ones. When they said shit gets very ugly, I wasn't talking about Demoncula Bar or whatever. On April 14, 2024, a snippet of the 10th edition of Adeptus Custodes Codex went around the community, as it described the existence of a female custodian. Prior to this, the Custodes were heavily suggested to have been an all-male faction, so naturally some people were very normal about this, and other statements clarified that a retcon did take place, as the current iteration of the Custodes had portrayed them as a mixed-gender fighting force since their inception. It was, to put it very lightly, a pretty awkward time in the community, with differing opinions on this edition and how it was unceremoniously executed. Also, a development while making this video, a few weeks ago an episode of Tithe was released that featured a female custodian for the first time outside of the Codex, and in a Warhammer community article, the reasoning was explained a little bit unlike the first time. This buried some odd rumors that female custodians were some unsanctioned rogue implementation, and spawned another very normal reaction from very normal people. Entering the newsphere, this is stuff actual hobbyists that play the game, read its books, or engage with the community are probably familiar with. Naturally, it's me here, so let's not waste any more time. Krieg is a nuclear shithole world and a segmentum tempestus, where not too long ago, it was an ordinary hive world that lived up to its name when it faced rebellion, and a civil war that culminated in nuclear annihilation. Whatever ecosystem Krieg had was wiped out, and the survivors took over whatever was left for the Imperium. The planet is now a wasteland populated by ruined hive cities and bunkers. Of most note about this world is how Krieg's history spurred the creation of its infamous Death Corps of Krieg. The Death Corps of Krieg is amongst the most infamous regiments of the Imperial Guard, even getting some representation on the tabletop. Their aesthetic is heavily influenced by the European armies of World War I, while their doctrine is based on being utterly inhuman as soldiers. As a sort of repentance for the rebellion of their world, they are raised to be unquestioning and unstoppable soldiers. They value their individual lives very little, and are up for any battlefield that might break the spirit of other Guard regiments. Amongst Death World regiments, they are perhaps the closest to being one with the war machine in a way a lot of Space Marines don't even approach. A smaller scale skirmish game for 40k, Kill Team was originally released in 2013 as an expansion for 6th edition. In 2016, it became a standalone game, with its 2nd and 3rd editions being released in 2018 and 2021 respectively. The 3rd edition was an overhaul for these rules and featured minis from some of the more underrepresented parts of different factions. These include Orc Commandos, Eldar Corsairs, Crude Mercenaries, Adeptus Arbites Enforcers, Inquisitor Retinues, Drukari Mandrakes, Genestealer Broodbrothers, and many, many more. More recently, in August 2024, the 4th edition of Kill Team was revealed, alongside a box featuring Tempestus Scions versus Vespids. This new edition reformatted some rules and added new co-op and solo play modes for Kill Team. The galactic supremacy of the Eldar was brought to an end as their 60 million year reign, and their particular form of psychic emotional sensitivity drove them to push the limits of sensation. This came to a head sometime in early M30 as mass hedonism broke down the order of the Eldar Empire. The Exodites were the first to flee, followed by the Craftworlders, as the Empire imploded with the birth of Slaanesh at the heart of it. 99% of the Eldar were consumed by Slaanesh, along with several of their gods, and surviving ones becoming significantly less active and powerful. The surviving Eldar are now cursed with their souls forfeit to Slaanesh should no preventative measure be taken upon their deaths. The Burst of Slaanesh would also reopen the Eye of Terror, and many worlds of the Eldar Empire, known as Crone Worlds, would be lost inside of it. Into the 41st millennium, the Empire is now fractured into 6 different factions that often still cling to arrogance as a way to remember their empire's lost power. To also get the actually out of the way, this event did not literally create Slaanesh, it was a catalyst for Slaanesh to become a power strong enough to rival the 3 other Chaos Gods. Way deeper into editing this, I just realized I missed the opportunity to clear up a misconception. The Eldar are not responsible for humanity's Age of Strife. Slaanesh's birth happened after that time, as it caused most of the warp storms to disappear. I'm not sure where this misconception really comes from, but it's a common one and makes sense if you get the events switched up chronologically. While much of the Eldar Empire territory in the Materium was lost in its fall, one of the greatest cities within the Webway became the stronghold for the Drukhari. Kamara is a port city, though that undersells the scale of it. There's no figures, but the city is powered by several stolen stars, and is split into several regions that include ports into real space and the rest of the Webway. There are also several markets, noble estates, slums, shrines, coliseums, arenas, workshops, and ports. All of this is then shadowed over by the cutthroat and hedonistic culture of the Drukhari, alongside the weirdness of the Webway. The anomaly located in the Segmentum Obscurus, once recognized as Cygnus X1 until named by Perturabo, the Eye of Terror is one of the biggest warp rifts in the galaxy, allowing for the Materium and Immaterium to overlap. This rift was created by the Old Ones before being sealed by the Necrons with their Blackstone technology some 60 million years ago. Tens of millions of years later, it was reopened during the catastrophic burst of Slaanesh, and is now used as a refuge for the most devoted heretics, especially Chaos Space Marines, who settle on its completely corrupted demon worlds. As the region is surrounded by warp storms and doesn't necessarily follow the laws of reality, the region is considered too dangerous for Imperial conquest and is surrounded by military forces that can intercept whatever may come out of the rift. Often referred to as the Great Rift, or by the Orcs as Gork's Grin, the Eldars Decidian, and the Taoists de Malyeva, the Cicatrix Maledictum is a massive expanse of several warp rifts that divides the galaxy in two. For the longest time, the pylons on Cadia and other Blackstone-rich planets suppressed this anomaly. However, the destruction of Cadia unleashed the Great Rift. Its creation threw the Imperium into disarray, as communications were lost, several planets were brought to ruin by warp anomalies or chaos incursions, and psychers began to appear in greater numbers than ever before. This also caused the Imperium to be separated into the Imperium Sanctus and Nihilus. While movement between the two regions isn't impossible, it's obviously dangerous, though there are a few spaces between the warp rifts that allow for safer passage. Introduced all the way back in 40k's first edition, the squads were the analog for Fantasy's dwarfs for 40k, as abhumans had just rallied together in their own civilization far away from the Imperium. They had an odd aesthetic, but usual for that old time, with motorcycles and land trains. Eventually they were phased out in 3rd edition, and in January 2000, a White Dwarf magazine was published that brought up the idea of the squads being eaten by Tyranids, which was in a way cemented in 2004. Between these times, something came up for Battlefleet Gothic in 2001, with a Xeno species called the Demiurge that were extremely similar to the squads. The squads would then continue to pop up as abhumans living amongst Imperial citizens, and the Demiurge would also continue to show up. In 2018, Necromunda received models for squad mercenaries. Finally, on April 1st, 2022, a video teaser for the Leagues of Votann popped up, and the next day, it was revealed that the return of squads was not an April Fool's joke. A divergent sect of humanity, the Leagues of Votann became playable for 40k with their codex published in October of the same year. Due to bans on artificial intelligence, the Mechanicum devised a way for machines to still perform complex actions using lobotomized humans that may or may not be stuck within their own suffering bodies. Created through either prisoners or, unfortunately, backgrown humans, servitors are a common sight in the Imperium, as they transport items, transmit messages, perform repairs, or even fight alongside Imperial forces. For simpler operations, the Mechanicus also uses servo skulls, which are like drones but fashioned from human skulls. I grouped these items together as they are both examples of the weird human element of Imperial technology, grimdark sci-fi or whatever. Once used as humble trading ships, craft worlds are massive vessels the size of planetoids that are used by the Eldar. Powered by what are essentially Eldar ghosts, these ships are central to keeping cohesion for the Eldar who rejected the descent of the Drukhari, being the home for billions of Eldar each. A craft world can hold cities, shrines, and even entire ecosystems, with the environment subject to manipulation by the psychic will of the Eldar. These ships are also escorted by several smaller ships as the craft world fleets hop in and out of the Webway as they make their way across the galaxy. Also known as the Yingir to the Eldar, The Catan are extremely old and powerful entities that some consider the fallen gods of the material plane. Prior to their current predicament, they fed from stars and clashed with the Old Ones, psychic aliens of similar if not greater power. The Necrons gave the Catan bodies of living metal, and in return asked for mortality, so naturally the Catan turned them into killer robots. The Catan defeated the Old Ones, but while the Catan started to kill each other afterwards for reasons I'll get to later, the Necrons took the opportunity to rebel and shattered their slavers. While the Catan were once feeding from stars and tearing up planetoids by looking at them funny, they are now shattered, with their fragments either imprisoned or weaponized by the Necrons. The dynasties now consider the Catan in this state as the absolute lowest of slaves. These fragments, or shards, are still potent weapons that can fling antimatter or wipe people from existence. Rumor has it that there is at least one Catan out there that isn't shattered, which is probably nothing to worry about. On the tabletop, Catan shards can be fielded as some of the most deadly units for the Necrons, channeling their primordial might in attacks that can cleave through almost any enemy with ease. And depending on the shard, they can even match Primarchs, or at least give them a battle they wouldn't soon forget. As for the more mortal warriors, unless they're named, they're probably fucked. A Psyker is a being that is able to channel the powers of the warp. Humans have the potential to be a Psyker, the Eldar and Orcs are innately psychic, but some are definitely more psychic than others, the Tyranids and Leaves of Votann have to create their Psykers, and the Tau and Necrons just don't produce Psykers. Through the Tau Empire, we can see that there are plenty of other Xenos races with psychic potential, but just not the Tau themselves. Said potential also comes in many forms, such as telepathy, telekinesis, divination, and a whole lot more that just varies between races. There's also plenty of disciplines Psykers specialize in. These Astartes have unique psychic disciplines that tie back to the culture of their world, or chapters, so an Iron Hands librarian might have unparalleled powers of technomancy, while also casting forth the harsh lightning of his homeworld. The Eldar, in their boundless cunning that keeps them from extinction, know powers of fortune, fate, talking to the dead, and more. An Orc Weirdboy channels the might of Gork and Mork to bolster their allies with murderous vigor or turn their enemies into squigs. The psychic beasts of the Tyranids channel the unfathomable hive mind to break their enemies or enhance its armies. An important moment in the history for many of the more significant Xenos factions, the War in Heaven took place 60 million years ago and saw the Necrons, led by the Catan, fighting against the Old Ones and their armies of various Xeno species. As the war grew desperate, the Old Ones created the Eldar and Quarks. However, the Old Ones were defeated as they unwittingly released monsters native to the warp that proceeded to wipe them out. Afterwards, the Necrons brought down their masters and went to sleep, the Eldar raised an empire, and the Quarks turned smaller and stupid. The War in Heaven can also refer to the mythological story of the Eldar, where Cain started to kill his own guys because he's a dick, but more specifically, the goddess Elias had a prophecy that the Eldar would one day kill him. Unhappy with this, Cain started to attack the Eldar, and the Phoenix King, Assyrian, put up a wall between the Eldar and their gods. Two other gods, Isha and Kurnos, were saddened by the disconnect, and when they found a way to continue talking to the Eldar, it was discovered by Cain, who reported it to the Assyrian. The Phoenix King gave Cain permission to punish the two gods however he saw fit, but it was cruel, and another god, Vol, wanted the prisoners released. Cain and Vol made a deal that if Vol were to make 100 swords in a year for the war god, Isha and Kurnos would be set free. Unfortunately, Vol was some kind of hack forge god, and when it was time to deliver, only 99 swords were completed, so he threw a dud mortal sword in there to potentially fool Cain. For a time, Cain was actually fooled, and his captives got their freedom, but when he did discover Vol's deception, he launched a war against the Forge God. At the height of battle between the clashing followers of the gods, Vol created his greatest sword, Anaris, but Vol wasn't a war god, so he got defeated by Cain. For a desperate Hail Mary, Anaris was delivered to the greatest hero of the Eldar, Eldanesh, so that he may defeat Cain, but again he was defeated, but in his case also killed. For killing a noble mortal like Eldanesh, Cain was cursed with his signature bloody hand, and with this, the War in Heaven ended. Now you know what's up with the dripping hand on the avatar of Cain. Also, if any of this sounds a little familiar, that's probably because it's notably influenced by the biblical story of Cain and Abel, mostly in just that final part, of a pivotal murder that curses the one who committed it. Of the 20 legions of Space Marines during the Great Crusade, Legions 2 and 11, alongside their Primarchs, are considered lost. Records of them are expunged or classified, and the remaining Primarchs had their memories of them wiped. There was a rumor that the slots for those two legions originally existed as room for fans to write their own ship, but that's made up. It started out as one of the big mysteries of the setting, and over the years, authors have explored it but never resolved it. We know a few things, such as the Lost Legions were around for the Great Crusade, of course, the Emperor ordered their destruction, and the Primarchs have sworn to not speak their names. There are several more tiny hints, but that's never really of consequence in the 41st millennium. Navigators are one of the Imperium's sanctioned abhuman species, best recognized for their signature third eye on their foreheads. They've been around long before the Imperium and were important for warp travel, even during the Dark Age of technology, as navigators are capable of making sense of the warp as a space to move through. From there, the captain can move their ship appropriately, steering clear of hazards and making an efficient journey through a realm that one doesn't want to spend any more time in than absolutely necessary. As they're in a weird position of being very important mutants in an empire where one of the central dogmas is kill the mutant, they have their own imperial administrative body, known as the Navis Nobilita, which is composed of several navigator houses that get up to noble house shenanigans, such as allegiances based on marriage and eugenics, which results in all manner of peculiar mutations. The Navis Nobilita is led by the Padronova, which is the most powerful navigator at the time. There's plenty more to say on them, but they're more for novels or role-playing settings rather than the tabletop. Not that they don't have no tabletop presence at all, but it is just one model, and that is run as an Imperial agent. Ogrins are another one of the Imperium's sanctioned abhumans, mostly because they're as strong as they are unintelligent, generally standing larger and even stronger than Space Marines. The Imperium has been fielding Ogrins since the Horus Heresy. They have a very childlike understanding of the world, but this allows them to be used as extremely simple and effective weapons for the Imperial Guard. They can get augmented with a biochemical Ogrin neural enhancement or bone, which brings them from child brain to just dumb brained. Ogrins with these augmentations are called boneheads, and that's what you play as in Darktide. Ogrins can be fielded on the tabletop, with their squadrons led by boneheads, which can all provide heavy fire support and devastating melee. Formerly recognized as the Battle of Isstvan V, the Dropside Massacre was one of the first battles of the Horus Heresy. After news of a rebellion led by Horus alongside his legion and the Fulgrim, Mortarion, and Angron, the legions of the Iron Hands, Salamanders, the Raven Guards, the Wordbearers, Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, and the Alpha Legion were deployed to crush Horus' forces, supported by Titans of Legion Artaris, Knights of House Golkak, and a bunch of Imperial Army soldiers. Unbeknownst to the Loyalist side, the Wordbearers, Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and Alpha Legion had flipped, and when they were supposed to arrive as reinforcements, they turned the battle into a massacre. This lays out a lot of key details for the rest of the heresy, such as the death of Varys Manus, Vulcan's capture, and the catastrophic damage for the Iron Hand, Salamanders, and Raven Guard. In 2017, the Horus Heresy became playable on the tabletop, with its first edition release based on 7th edition 40k rules. The second edition was released in 2022, and that's what's currently being supported. The games are based around Resin Forge Worlds minis, and armies almost entirely of Astartes from the 18 legions, even with their Primarchs. Other armies include the Custodes, Mechanicum, Solar Auxilia, Night Houses, and most infamously, the Collegia Titanica, with their models being the biggest and most expensive amongst all Warhammer minis. All of these models are based on a time long before 40k, so the units have different armor, vehicles, equipment, and so on. Basically nothing from 40k can be deployed for Horus Heresy. In 40k's 9th edition, the Space Marines could share some units, but that didn't carry over for 10th edition. The Custodes still share units because, quite frankly, they have peanuts for a roster. Lastly, there are several campaign books for players to run games based on the various historical battlefields of the Horus Heresy. At the time of recording, there are 69 official video games for 40k. To not spend time on a bunch of video games across the iceberg, I made a little roundup here. The first 40k game was Space Crusade in 1992 by Gremlin Interactive. 40k generally lent itself to strategy games, but there was a notable deviation in 2003 with the Rio Halo killer Fire Warrior. A lot of video games have adapted to the Space Hulk game as recently as 2017. There's also the action RPG Inquisitor Martyr in 2018. 2021 had Necromunda Hired Gun, which was generally agreed to be kind of cool but also kind of disappointing. Then there's Tacticus in 2022, a mobile game which has probably been advertised at some point to you. The same year also brought Blood, Teeth, and Shoot Us, which is, to put it lightly, an absolute blast. These last few years have been pretty decent 40k games, but for the longest time, Games Workshop had a reputation for passing around the 40k IP to whoever had an uninteresting idea, which, for a few decades, led to a great deal of disappointment for many fans. Also known as Abaddon the Despoiler, or just the War Master, Ezekiel Abaddon is one of the top commanders for the heretical legions, and undoubtedly the most active one as well. Abaddon once served alongside Horus himself, as the first captain of the Luna Wolves and an advisor to the Primarch. In those times, Abaddon was an exceptional warrior, though after Horus' death, Abaddon would step up to take over his legion. From there, the Sons of Horus became the Black Legion, and we start to hear more of the greater stories about Abaddon. Through various trials, he's attained the favor of the 4 Chaos Gods and 6 of the surviving traitor Primarchs. He's also killed a bunch of Horus clones and launched the 13 Black Crusades. Wielding the Demon Sword, Draknien, the Primarch's weapon, the Talon of Horus, a unique set of Terminator armor, and the Mark of Chaos Undivided, he's one of the most dangerous combatants in the galaxy. With the Black Legion, he's also one of the most prolific warlords in service of Chaos. In the 40k community, there's a lot of people who don't know what they're talking about, and some of them talk about Abaddon. There are some people that think Abaddon was a bad villain that Games Workshop beat into being a competent one through retcons. Said supposed retcons include making the initial 12 Black Crusades into victories, the Cadian pylons were made up to give Abaddon a way to execute his 13th Black Crusade, and that the 13th Black Crusade was retconned into a victory for Abaddon when it was originally a defeat. This mostly all just stems from the never-ending game of telephone played by the community, but Abaddon has had some genuinely bad canon appearances, with the most prominent one coming to mind being from Soul Hunter by Aaron Dembski-Bowden. He's not any kind of sympathetic or charming antagonist, neither of which he should be, but that also makes him hard to like in the traditional sense. Also, his old mini had a problem with arms in his stick, and he was made fun of for that.
Even in death I still serve.
In the case that a Space Marine is wounded beyond recovery but nevertheless alive, the Tech Marines of the chapter will attempt to inter the incapacitated Marine into a Dreadnought. The Dreadnought itself comes in a few different types, such as the long-serving box-shaped Castaferum, the modern Redemptor designed with Primaris Marines in mind, and plenty more variants, drawing from the aforementioned or other patterns, some of which have fallen out of favor or even existence in the 41st millennium. Universally, they're all some kind of massive combat walker, using the powerful mind of the Space Marine inside. While a brutal existence of almost entirely warfare, Dreadnoughts are valued highly by their chapters, and Marines sometimes speak with their half-dead brothers in search of some ancient wisdom. While mech suits are a sci-fi staple, and there are others in 40k that are more conventional, this interpretation of the trope is one that stuck with 40k's fans, is one perfectly apt for the setting. Additionally, Dreadnoughts are like a trope to 40k itself, and other factions have similar combat walkers with an interred pilot. The Adeptus Custodes have their own patterns of Dreadnoughts under the Mortatoi warrior caste. Dreadnoughts being used by the forces of Chaos often find themselves cursed as ship, but no less deadly. A Dreadnought being used by a Chaos Marine isn't necessarily a Hellbrute, but those aforementioned cursed ones are. Hellbrutes essentially meld the interred Marine and the Dreadnought body together. It drives the Marine inside completely insane, but they're still dangerous in their own way. The Xenos forces also have their own takes on the Dreadnought. The Death Dreads of the Orcs have a volunteering Orc permanently hooked up to a combat walker with all manners of claws, kill saws, rocket launches, scorchers, and shooters. Killicans are similar, but smaller and designed for Gretchen. It's a sucky existence on paper, but it's as close as one can get to being one with the Daka. The Craftworld Eldar also have a few methods of having their dead fight on the battlefield. Constructs such as the Wraith Guard and Wraith Lord are combat vessels for the souls of dead Eldar pulled out of an Infinity Circuit. Wraith Knights are similar, but these are piloted by twins, with one alive and the other dead. It's frowned upon and reserved for desperate times, but the Eldar live and breathe desperate times. Back in the War in Heaven, the Old Ones with their unparalleled psychic power carved out a labyrinthine space within the warp known as the Webway. It allowed for a safe, faster-than-light travel, and once they started to raise their own Xenospecies for war against the Necrons, the Eldar would be given access to it. Necrons, demons, and even humans have found ways to get into it and use it for their own ends, but it's hardly conducive to humans, and Necrons have their own methods of faster-than-light travel. Demons just kind of infest some corners of it. The Webway itself also tries to repair any breaches, but it can fail in this attempt. It can be entered through gates you can either find or buy from Warhammer.com, which can be large enough to fit some large aircraft through, and with the reach the Eldar Empire once had, there are countless gates across the galaxy. So Webway isn't exactly mapped, but the gates that are out there define certain clear tunnels that the average mortal probably wouldn't be able to make sense of. It's a mysterious place, and in some ways, less defined than even the warp, so we'll be revisiting this topic a few times. With Slaanesha's curse on the Eldar, they found ways to get around guaranteed eternal torture on death. Spirit stones are one such method, and should the Eldar possessing it die, their soul is drawn into the Spirit Stone, which can be brought back to a craft world to be uploaded to its infinity circuit. Interestingly enough, the Spirit Stones are believed to have been first created by the Eldar god Vol from the tears of Isha that she wept from being cut off from her children. The Spirit Stones allowed Isha to communicate with the Eldar, and whether or not that is something they're still capable of in any capacity is unknown, but also unlikely. Malcador the Sigillite was the Emperor's #1 dick rider, and behind establishing a lot of the weirder, more secretive bodies of the Imperium. He's claimed to have been around for 6,700 years by the time of the Horus Heresy, which would put his birth before the Age of Strife that sent humanity down the toilet. His title, the Sigillite, comes from an order that he was a part of called the Sigillites, which dedicated itself to the preservation of various important artifacts in the midst of humanity's downfall. Their stronghold is rumored to have been the foundation for the Imperial Palace, and perhaps the Vaults of Terra itself. As for what's more certain, Malcador teamed up with the Emperor during the Unification Wars, and would become the first Lord of Terra, as he got to work managing the Imperium while the Emperor went crusading. During the Unification Wars, Malcador established the Officio Assassinorum, and in the wake of the Horus Heresy, he gathered loyalist space marines, including some from traitor legions, for a strike force called the Knights Errant, which were the predecessors to the Grey Knights. Following the, frankly, more likely narrative that Malcador created the Inquisition, before the Siege of Terra, the Emperor ordered that Malcador get some badass ensemble for heresy investigations. Malcador got 8 marines from the Knights Errant and 4 humans, with the latter folk becoming the first Inquisitors. Something I haven't mentioned yet is that Malcador is an extremely powerful psyker. Community consensus puts him at the 3rd strongest human psyker during the Horus Heresy behind Magnus. He hid the moon Titan in the warp, survived getting bitch-slapped by Lorgar unscathed, and telekinetically strangled Horus, and the narrative implied that it had a chance of actually killing him. Most importantly, he would take the Emperor's place on the Golden Throne when he went to confront Horus. Even as he was literally dissolving, he held on until the half-dead Emperor was returned to the throne. This sacrifice is where his recognition as Malcador the Hero among some Imperial citizens comes from. He even has one of the highest honors any Imperial can have, with a tank design named after him. Sly Marbo, which is an amalgam of a name composed of a nickname for Sylvester Stallone and an anagram for Rambo, is an infamous soldier of the Katakan Jungle Fighters, a regiment hailing from a death world where all the fauna either actively or inadvertently tries to kill the human population. Surrounded by secrecy and hearsay, Marvel has accumulated a reputation for being as deadly as an Imperial assassin or a Space Marine through the power of sheer cunning and grit. A solitary soldier, nobody except his commanding officer has any good idea as to how the hell Marbo does what he does, which leaves only stories amongst the guardsmen and official records, more blacked out than an early 2010s SCP document. He's killed plenty of orcs and has a reputation as an assassin of war bosses. Rumor has it that he hunted lictors for sport during the Octarius War, while there's another, somehow more likely rumor that he destroyed a traitor warlord titan, though specifics as to how this happened are classified. Outside of the lore, he's kind of a living meme a la Chuck Norris, but he can also be fielded on the tabletop as a very mobile and extremely deadly, though not particularly durable, lone operative. If Erebus did not exist, would the heresy still happen? Probably. Would things have gone better? Absolutely. Erebus was an extremely devout follower of the old faith of Kulkas, a religion devoted to the ruin of power, though under different names. Ever since he joined the Word Bearers, he recognized the threat the Emperor posed to chaos and plotted to bring it down. So, basically, Erebus got Horus stabbed with a knife that incapacitated him, giving Erebus the opportunity to fuck with his mind a little, and convinced him the Emperor had to go. While there were definitely other Primarchs that would have likely, or even inevitably turned on the Emperor, Horus was unlikely to do so, but he was also the one capable of rallying together all these dissatisfied Primarchs for a proper war. Erebus would also point Lorgar towards the gods of chaos once the Emperor rejected his worship. If Horus never turned, Magnus would have no reason to warn the Emperor of anything, which will keep his Webway project alive. Kurz could have also been healed of his badness, and the betrayal from Fulgrim, Perturabo, Angron, or Rotarian could have easily been handled. Hell, if Erebus never existed, Lorga might not have turned to chaos, though Corfarian would probably push for Lorgra's fall to chaos. Erebus also killed Gabriel Loken while he was mourning over Horus no less, in order to create the powerful demon Samus. Existing outside of linear time, Samus already played a tiny part in starting the heresy, yet another way the Horus heresy was kind of Erebus' fault. For all of this, many fans say fuck Erebus. The Dark Age of technology refers to the time between the 15th and 25th millennium of humanity's history. Back then, humanity started to develop their first psychers and navigators. This allowed them to tap into warp travel, kick off their interstellar civilization, and even show us aliens. They built robots, teleporters, terraforming tech. Fun fact, Mars didn't always look like that. Antimatter guns, bombs that send targets directly into the warp, cannons that basically telefrag their targets into themselves, and replication systems for all of these things called Standard Template Constructs, or STCs. The Imperium still has little bits of the impressive tech here and there, but it's often hard or even heretical to replicate. Also, a ton of this shit was lost in the Age of Strife and even the Horus Heresy, setting the stage for the technological purgatory that the Imperium finds itself in.
500 last guns.
An aforementioned piece of technology from the Dark Age, Standard Template Constructs, or STCs, were essentially fabricators combined with massive databases. As many fell to disrepair or destruction, the Mechanicus highly values any surviving STCs, as they're not only capable of producing technology, but perhaps containing the schematics for new technology. Due to the Mechanicus' beliefs on developing technology themselves, discovering STCs is one of the only ways to push the Imperium's technology without offending anyone. To put into perspective the value of STCs, in the novel First and Only by Dan Nabnet, the stories recounted of how two Imperial guardsmen found an STC that built a nice fit for Space Marines that were also a general improvement over their previous model. Those two lucky guardsmen got a planet each to govern over. Unfortunately, in the same book, an STC is discovered that spat out chaos-corrupted men of iron, so discovering an STC can end in all sorts of ways. But regardless, the Imperium is very interested in having every STC accounted for, as he can turn the tide of a war either way. One of the key events that kicked off the Age of Strife and humanity's downfall was the Cybernetic Revolt. For reasons not entirely clear, though perhaps rooted in the realization that robots could probably do anything that humans could do better, much of humanity's artificial intelligence systems turned on their masters. Leading the whole effort was the Men of Iron, though humanity still had access to plenty of their own technology. The weapons deployed destroyed planets, stars, space, and time. Humanity also had to deal with many of their psychers becoming unstable or succumbing to the perils of the warp, alongside a drastic increase in warp storms. With the warp's hyperactivity in mind, some posit that the Cybernetic Revolt might have been the work of chaos, so this could be an unfortunate coincidence. While humanity ultimately pulled through and left almost no Man of Iron alive, it left interstellar civilizations scattered and devastated. This event is also why the Mechanicum is extremely wary about any talk of artificial, or as they often call it, abominable intelligences. Hailing from the planet's Peck, the Kroot are one of the top allies of the Tau and members of their empire ever since the first sphere expansion back in the 30th millennium. While somewhat avian in appearance, they are capable of adapting the traits from species that they consume the flesh of. While they can easily be identified by their often green skin, or at least the presence of a beak, they can have more amphibious or reptilian appearances. Depending on what they eat, they can even become extremely muscular with the stature of a gorilla and the strength of a space marine, or grow wings, or even develop psychic powers. However, there is a default form for the Kroot, and should they focus too much on one passive mutation, they can lose their potential to become anything else. This transformation makes them rather animalistic, but they can get along with their fellow Kroot. Weirdly enough, this is why a bunch of animals on Peck are actually just a different species of Kroot, like if cats, dogs, birds, and hamsters were just different species of human. Kroot often appear on the battlefield as an auxiliary force for the Tau, or as mercenaries. While the evolutionary capabilities of the Kroot are certainly their standout feature, they can also just shoot people with guns and travel through space. They even have warp drive, which the actual Tau don't have. On the tabletop, they have plenty of models, but are run with the rules from the Tau Codex. They have close quarters capabilities not often seen among the Tau, and fight like guerrilla commandos, getting ahead of the enemy at least with on-foot mobility, which can cover for the squishiness. Matt Ward was the designer for Games Workshop from about 2003 to 2014 before returning in 2016. While he did some work for the fantasy games, including an infamous army book for the Demons of Chaos, his work on the 5th edition Space Marines Codex and onwards is why he's on this Iceberg. That book framed the Ultramarines as some sort of paragon for all other chapters, while the Grey Knights Codex for the same edition introduced Caldor Drago, and that one time Grey Knights killed a bunch of Thoritas to cover themselves in their blood because apparently that has some purifying effect. He also wrote the Necrons as we know them today, the Sanguinor that one time the Blood Angels and Necrons put aside their differences by Tyrannus, and some other shit that I don't really care about. He's kind of the reason why there's a forced Ultramarine say that's really 2010s. Of course there's motives beyond one man behind every codex of publishing, like selling new models, and there's someone who has to approve that work. He's just become the singular name a bunch of people blamed for whatever complaints they had. There's a reason why there's no credits on codices anymore, even though that might be standard for other war games and TTRPGs. Nowadays, he's been authoring his own novels and has participated in some video games related to the fantasy and 40k settings. Of course, he still also works with Games Workshop, although what he does there is not really known. Adeptus Titanicus is an epic-scale war game released in 1988 that allows players to reenact battles of the Horus Heresy with the Imperium's most infamous war machines, the Titans. This game would also feature miniatures for Eldar and Orc Titan armies. It would get a 2nd edition in 1994, which is where this piece of absolutely insane artwork comes from, and featured minis for the Imperator Titan and Mega Gargant, some of the biggest Titan-type units in 40k. While this game line turned into the epic scale 40k that I'll get to another time, a Titan-focused, slightly larger than epic scale game set in the Horus Heresy came out 30 years after the 1st edition. A reboot with the same name, this is more in line with the Horus Heresy game line, and it allows players to field Titans without blasting holes in their wallets, or at least smaller ones. Karn the Betrayer, Typhus the Traveler, Ahriman the Lucius the Eternal. These four are some of the most infamous champions of chaos, and each are represented on the tabletop, signature characters for their legions. I bundled them together in one entry, so I won't be dumping their biographies here, but here's the essentials for each. Karn was once the captain of the Ace Assault Company for the Warhounds Legion. While Ingron was distraught at being conscripted into service of the Emperor, many officers tried to ease his fury and got killed in the process. Karn succeeded where they failed, and he became a close advisor to his Primarch. He would also be the first to be implanted with the Butcher's Nails by his own choice, as part of a movement within the Legion for all world leaders to receive the implants, killing all those who resisted. Though not exactly deliberate, he has a massive share of the blame for his Legion's fall to Khorne. Even when he was cut down by Sigismund during the Siege of Terra, he came back, perhaps a sign of deeper chaos corruption. In a battle between the world leaders and Emperor's children on the demon world of Scalasrax, Karn saw his men taking refuge in a ceasefire, as the planet's conditions would quickly kill anyone who tried to continue the fight. Enraged, Karn took a flamer to burn out his men and force them into battle. Many of them resisted, but none who tried survived. For this, he gained the title of Betrayer. He also has a kill tracker in his helmet that reportedly records that he's killed over 1 million people with his chain axe, but that's neither here nor there. Typhus, once Callus Typhon, was born of a human mother and an overlord father, interestingly making him some kind of half-mutant or half-Xeno space marine. He was also a repressed psyker, which made him an odd friend for a young Mortarion, but friends were in short supply on the grim planet of Barbarous. Once Mortarion was reunited with the Emperor, Typhon would be inducted into the Death Guard as one of the rare adult recruits, and would receive the position of First Captain. During the Great Crusade, he turned to Chaos worship, and though Mortarion turned traitor for his petty reasons, Typhon followed suit for his own reasons. While on the raid of Terra and acting on advice from a certain bald bastard, Typhon led Mortarion and his legion into the warp in a trap. Denying the legion navigators and with no sense of direction in the Sea of Souls, Typhus' trap allowed the Death Guard to be infected with the Destroyer Plague, one of Nurgle's most vile concoctions. Trapped in eternal pain, Mortarion was given an offer by Nurgle that damned his legion in a more tolerable sense, and he accepted. Surrendering to the Rotfather, the Primarch and his legion were released from the Destroyer Plague, now at the Plague God's service. And for his service, Typhon became fully corrupted as a living vessel for the Destroyer Plague. In his ascension, and now dedicated to spreading the gifts of Nurgle far and wide, he's known as Typhus the Traveler. Osvic Araman was a Terran-born Marine of the Thousand Sons who held various positions of power within the Legion, including Chief Librarian and First Captain. Profoundly terrified of the flesh chain curse that took his brother and still loomed over the rest of his Legion, he was devoted to curing it, but discovering how Magnus knew more about the condition than he let on, tore apart loyalties. After the disastrous burning of Prospero, the Thousand Sons were left decimated, but fought tooth and nail against the Imperium that was now turned against them. In the end, Armin and his Legion fled to the warp in even worse shape while still facing the flesh change, which is where the rubric of Armin comes in. This spell was meant to rid the Legion of the flesh change once and for all, which it did at the cost of turning all the Thousand Sons legionaries without psychic powers into mindless automata, while those with psychic powers would become even more powerful. Disgusted by Armin's choice, Magnus exiled his premier sorcerer. I kind of just realized, Vincent, in the middle of recording, I think he's called Armin the Exile. I think that's his cool title. Since then, he has sought ways to not only further his power as a sorcerer, but also undo the rubric and restore the Legion once and for all. Unfortunately, Finch finds this very, very, very funny. Lucius was one of the Chemos-born Marines of the Emperor's Children. He was a polymath of sorts and took a particular liking to swordsmanship, but he was also a massive bastard and got recruited by the Legion after barely winning a fight with some older champion. By some good fortune, he became the captain of the 13th Company while he was amongst the best swordsmen of all of the legions, perhaps amongst names like Shaurkin, Loken, Sevatar, and Sigismund, but he also had a lot less discipline than anyone I just named. While he had a little stint as one of the loyalist Emperor's children, being the underdog or second fiddle to someone else was unappealing to him, so he flipped back to his Primarch side. So he spent most of the heresy getting wrapped up in Vinch schemes beyond the scope of this summary. After the heresy, he got a cursed blessing thing from Slanesh, where whoever kills him becomes a vessel for Lucius to return, while the vessel becomes another face in his armor. For this, he's known as Lucius the Eternal. While there was some rules that the opponent had to feel some pride in the kill in order for the curse to activate, that was actually a big lie, and to be honest, Lucius does stick out as one of the big four champions of chaos, doesn't he? Okay, so Lucius has this curse thing that prevents him from being killed with a rule that's about as effective as a party-sized label in a bag of chips, and is generally a bit of a bastard. There's a long-running discussion where people think up of ways killing Lucius once and for all, because no one likes him. Karn has some badass moments in the heresy and is a convincing force of nature. Typhus has a little nurgling. Armin is always getting in some situation, and Lucius is getting excuses for not being written out of the setting. He's just really, really hard to root for at all. So, the name corn sounds a lot like corn the vegetable. There's Kellogg's cornflakes, created in 1894 by Will Keith Kellogg to feed his patients at a sanitarium he owned. Naturally, the community has some jokes about the names. Hell, in Prince of Blood by Laurie Golding, which is a short story, there was also a joke about Karn's name being mistaken for corn. And Karn's name also derives from the Arabic word Kain, which means betrayer, making Karn the Betrayer sound comically redundant. There's actually so many name jokes across 40k if you know where to look. Written by Robert Rath and released in the dark times of October 2020, The Infinite and the Divine is a novel that follows the cat-and-mouse game between Trazyn the Infinite and Organ the Diviner. The former is an eccentric collector of oddities, while the latter is an extremely powerful chronomancer, and both are investigating the planet of Serenade in search of the legendary tomb of a very special Necron. Luckily, Trazyn and Organ are both Necrons as well, so they have plenty of time to crack this mystery and stoke the flames of their rivalry. The Infinite and Divine has been hailed by many as amongst the best novels of Black Library. It's a common entry-level recommendation, and puts a lot of eyes on the Necrons, especially Trazyn. Released between March 2017 and February 2019 in 13 parts for a 2.5-hour long runtime, Hellreach was created by Richard Boylan. Based on the Hellreach novel and using a mix of voice actors and the audiobook reading by Jonathan Keeble, Hellreach is a 3D animated fan film following the Black Templar Reclusiarch, or Top Chaplain, Merc Grimaldus, and his command over the defense of Hive Hellreach against an onslaught of orcs as part of the Third War for Armageddon. It's basically the only 40k film with a theatrical runtime that you can actually recommend to somebody, and it's pretty good. The Pariah Nexus is an area in the southeast corner of the galaxy controlled by the Necrons. Through the technology of the Necrons and their knowledge of the elusive Blackstone, they have set up a region in space in which the warp is completely inert. As all humans have subtle ties to the warp through their emotions, thoughts, or souls, the disconnect between the Materium and Immaterium has killed the locals, and the powers of navigators and psychers are suppressed greatly. I'll talk about Pariah some other time, but their anti-psyker abilities is where this region gets its name from. This phenomenon is known as distilling, and the Imperium has gotten very interested in this region. The Pariah Nexus was a pet project of sorts for the Silent King himself, who assembled various dynasties loyal to him to defend it against imperial curiosity. Belisarius Cawl led the offensive with a focus on extracting the local Blackstone, while the Sautek dynasty led by Imhotep took the advantage of the ongoing war to challenge the Silent King's authority by waging a war of his own against him. Naturally, the war in the Pariah Nexus turned to a shit show, which culminated with the use of increasingly destructive superweapons between the Mechanicus and the Necrons. This included gravity whips, a virus that turned anything into slime, a dwarf star propelled into an Imperial fleet, and some kind of chronophagic weaponry. The last one of these weapons to be unleashed was something called Shivarak's Constellation, a bunch of tiny satellites far older than the Imperium itself, equipped with unidentified weapons, which was deployed without safety regulators, as the Dominus deploying them was paranoid of it being sabotaged, and thought that this measure would ensure its operation. Unfortunately, with the help of the warfare destroying some of the nearby pylons, the satellites started to destroy everything and exploded, creating a warp rift that allowed for Vastor the Archivane to step through. While followed up a bit with White Dwarf 501 in June 2024, which detailed the further actions from the Forces of Chaos, such as a few of the local war bands, interference from the Thousand Suns, and a raid for a gene seed by Fabius Bile, this is where the story ends for now. Apparently, Gilliman is supposed to be making his way to the Pariah Nexus, and Vastor is writing the shattered remains of what was once the Dark Angel's home planet, with her chapter recently welcoming back their long absent Primarch. That's likely where the story will pick up from in the future. This saga is also where the animated series Pariah Nexus takes place, which follows a battle sister and a space marine as they try to survive this strange and hostile environment. It's not much, but it's not bad either. A common understanding of how the Orc Wa field works outside of the overt psychic actions of Weird Boys and the increasing threat of the Orcs describe it as a collective quote-unquote power of imagination. The Orc Boy believes its shooter will fire, therefore it will fire, even if it lacks ammo. Is this true? No. But it's a theory within the Mechanicus and a meme within the community. As a demonstration of this joke, there's the meme of how is the Emperor alive after 10,000 years on a failing piece of technology. It's because the orcs think he's alive. The more orcs, the more trouble. That's a simple way to put it. Alright, to not leave this incomplete, essentially orcs have some inexplicable way to instinctively gather together to beat the shit out of everyone in their way. Orcs will always know who's the boss and how to wage war. Even as a little tribe born out of spores in a backwater world millions of miles away from their fellow greenskins, orcs will find each other, pick a boss, and start cobbling together scrap to start making weapons, armor, vehicles, and eventually spaceships. The more orcs there are, or the more fighting there is, the more dangerous escalation will be. It's perhaps a sort of dynamic method of adaptation that allows orcs to match their foe no matter what they are. What we, as beings of the Materium, don't see is that the orcs have some tiny psychic spark inside each and every one of them that gets more powerful as they rally and fight. It keeps their weird little culture going, and their psyker weird boys can channel some of this energy out with powers such as the jump. Once upon a time, the Emperor relied on psycho-mutant meatheads to be his trusted soldiers for the Unification Wars. While the Custodians were always the shield, the Thunder Warriors were the giant fuck-off chainsword, and some of them could even be interred within mechs should they be injured beyond recovery. Each of them were massive soldiers, armed with bolters, chainswords, and an inhuman physiology that allowed them to fight like freight trains. While they weren't exactly without equals among the many mutant fighters on Terra, those equals were few and far between. If the phrase psycho-mutant meathead or any of the other things I just said sound familiar, that's because the Thunder Warriors were the predecessors for the more familiar Space Marines, and after the Unification Wars, the Emperor tried to wipe out the Thunder Warriors to make way for the physically weaker, so far more stable and competent Space Marines. While history tells that the Thunder Warriors perished in the Battle of Mount Ararat, the reality is that the Emperor called them all together to be executed by the Custodes at the aforementioned mountain. There is also the belief that the Thunder Warriors attempted rebellion, seeing their biology as an intentionally placed cruel burden from the Emperor, but they were crushed in this attempt. While many of them really did go out swinging, some of them did escape. Some groups of fugitive Thunder Warriors were hunted down by the Dark Angels Legion, while one group managed to join up with the inmates of the prison colony Cerberus, whose insurrection was stamped out by the Warhounds Legion. Another group of 4 Thunder Warriors hid out on Terra as gladiators, though by the end of the Siege of Terra, all of them had perished. There was also Auric Tyrannus, who lived as a gang lord on Terra while trying to find some way to cure the instability of his kind. With the help of some Space Marine gene seed, he did manage to find a cure, but he would succumb to his own instability before being able to go far with his discovery. Lastly, perhaps by some machination of Malcador, Endrid Har would be integrated into the World Eaters Legion, and after their betrayal, he fought on as a Black Shield. Once upon a time, Cato Sicarius was the captain of the Ultramarine 2nd Company, and before that, a sergeant for the 8th Company, and these days, he was kind of the worst among Ultramarines without being one of the more stereotypical Codex Astartes adherents with a stick up his ass. He was a narcissist, egoist, son of a noble, and an asshole dropped in the middle of Macragge's finest, as can be seen in books such as Blades of Damocles and Fall of Damnos. Unfortunately, a certain author really liked the Ultramarines, so we got to see plenty of Sicarius. Eventually, the text-to-speech series got around to making a hyperbolic depiction of Sicarius, and saying I, Cato Sicarius, in a very annoying voice became his shtick, which stuck with fans. While I don't doubt it's out there, I actually couldn't find any excerpts where Cato Sicarius says the words I, Cato Sicarius. If you find one, let me know. As for more modern times, Cato Sicarius kinda got thrown into the warp for a while, and came back as a proper, more traditional, ultra-depressed hero of his legion, now serving as the captain of the Vitrix Guard, which is the honor guard of the Ultramarines. People like him a lot more now this way. Out in the eastern fringe of the galaxy, the once legendary military leader of the Tau Empire, Commander Farsight, has established an independent society away from the Empire. This society is known as the Farsight Enclaves, or to the Tau Empire, the Forbidden Zone, though that's kind of because the Enclaves are located in a place already called the Forbidden Zone. The Enclaves were sort of founded in the expedition that uncovered a demonic presence. Commander Farsight was survived from the initial encounter, and as the accompanying Ethereals were all killed, Farsight was worried about the threat the demons posed, and that the Ethereals may have actually known about it, yet kept it a secret. As the expedition was already colonizing a few worlds, Commander Farsight turned them into an enclave, which is mostly run by the Fire Caste, though the other castes, bar the Ethereal, have a place, as do the alien auxiliaries. With the help of an oversized sword that extends the life of the wielder with each kill, Farsight has managed to stay alive as a central figure for the Enclaves, so he can defend them from the constant orc raids. As the government isn't run by dumb cartoon villains like the Ethereals, the work and doctrines of the Enclaves is often quite noble for the setting. For this tiny corner of the galaxy, it's not much, but it's honest work. In early November of 2022, rumors began to circulate that the upcoming codex for the Astra Militarum would speak of the deaths of one of the Imperium's most esteemed heroes, Commissar Sebastian Yarick. Tragically, this was confirmed on November 15th, as the Bell of Lost Souls told for the Fallen Commissar, and a Warhammer community article was published that gave more insight into what was going on. With a preview into what the book said about his deaths, it gave a eulogy recounting his role in defending Hive Hades of Armageddon across its 3 wars. In the first, he lost his arm to an orc war boss, and after slaying the Greenskin, he managed to use his power claw in place of his lost arm. If that sounds odd, that's because most accounts tell that this actually happened during the Second War of Armageddon, and that he wasn't even involved in the first. With that in mind, and also some heavy redacting on the eulogy, people were reluctant to see this news and take it at face value. While his skull was right there for all to see, how did this hero of the Imperium actually die? He might have succumbed to natural causes, but most of the Imperium's elite have ways to work around that. The more likely answer would naturally be that he died in battle, which then raises the question of whodunit. The top suspects are Angron, who showed up during the Third War for Armageddon, which would also explain the redactions, and Gazgul Magurk Sraka, the top Orc war boss who showed some respect for Yark as an exceptionally good foe that he didn't want to kill too soon. There's also rumor that he's not actually dead at all, for reasons that could range from a dumb administratum error to some conspiracy of the Inquisition, which, with their moral integrity, they're just as likely to actually kill him. A reasoning for these conspiracies is that the higher ups might think that word of Yark's death could boost morale, but the cost may be too great to be reasonable, or more importantly, believable. Regardless of the truth, which perhaps we might uncover someday in the months or more likely years to come, I remember how the community went through the 5 stages of grief over the loss of a beloved character. There was a lot of stage 2, but that's only natural for 40k fans. According to old Imperial and Mechanicus legends, once upon a time in the Terra's 11th or 12th century, long before the age of the Imperium, the God Emperor clashed with a dragon. Upon its defeat, this beast was sealed beneath the surface of Mars, and it cast out a subtle manipulation upon the people of the Red Planet, planting the seeds for the Adeptus Mechanicus to be formed tens of thousands of years later. Or so the stories go anyway. There is definitely something down there, imprisoned by a vast complex known as the Noctis Labyrinth, that the Mechanicus has kept secure over the millennia. The 11th or 12th century story might also be wrong, as another interpretation of Mechanicus posits that the battle occurred in the late 3rd or early 4th century, with this battle being remembered as the battle between St. George and the dragon. As for what the dragon actually is, with several little details compiled by the Mechanicus and a few outsider perspectives in mind, best spelled out in Mechanicum by Graham McNeil, it is definitely some Catan shard of Magladros, the Void Dragon. The Void Dragon is a particularly technology-oriented Catan shard, and while not very draconic, it's at least got the wings. As for what a Catan shard could be doing on Mars, and what it means for the Imperium to have one of these so deep in Imperial territory, that's up in the air, though I wouldn't worry about it so much. The Imperium has arguably worse things locked up in the solar system. The Imperium has separated its official languages into 2 boxes, High Gothic and Low Gothic. High Gothic is the language you see in some of the Imperium's central factions. It's said to be the premier language of mankind prior to the Age of Strife, though it's stylistically a lot like Latinizing, straight up using Latin, or working someone's name into that framework. For one example, the Inquisition's Ordo Malleus is really close to just being Latin for Order of the Hammer. In universe, however, the High Gothic Ordo Malleus does actually translate into Order of the Hammer in Low Gothic, which is the Imperium's term for the language of commoners. Your bartender talks in Low Gothic, the hive gangers talk in Low Gothic, the guardsmen talk in Low Gothic, the tech priest would probably yell at their regular human workers in Low Gothic, so on and so forth. The funny thing about Low Gothic is that it comes in countless dialects that are functionally just completely different languages, but they're all still recognized as bastardized versions of High Gothic. Some planets that are more isolated have indigenous languages that are not recognized as Low Gothic, but that's not really of the higher-ups' concern. This is how you get Space Marines that are all nobles of a sort in the Imperium's hierarchy, but have clashing name motifs or have some positions renamed entirely. Okay, a quick heads up, the audio gets completely messed up here. It's something I had to do in order to look. This was kind of edited like a Jenga tower, so forgive me, please. The Imperium at its core takes from various authoritarian regimes across history, varying aspects of fascist states, theocracies, and feudal civilizations, and since their influence has only worsened since its founding 10,000 years ago, that's not going to change anytime soon. While these are all ideas with no place in modern society, and 40k is a fictional setting in which those ideas can be explored a little, some people do like the Imperium's ideas because there's always at least one of any kind of person. And as the Imperium is the protagonist of the whole setting, as in always front and center, and they have to always be some kind of cool to sell minis and novels and whatever, the setting does end up appealing to a lot of weird right-wing types. And 40k fans have probably heard some horror story about the neo-Nazi who showed up at a tournament, or how a major YouTuber or two who talks 40k has also said a lot of edgy shit. Funny enough, because of that reputation, there's also a sizable group of far-left 40k fans who've rallied together as the online spaces puts more stream figures only a stray post away. Either way, hopping onto social media whenever there's some kind of 40k news beyond the minis can get pretty ugly and tiresome, and by ugly and tiresome, I mean I've seen death and rape threats over this shit. Personally, I'm not particularly fond of either side very much, especially those who get all high and mighty about their beliefs. That's just out of principle. There's also something I've seen a lot more with right-wingers, where they co-opt some of the attributes of the Imperium in a LARPy kind of way. It can get annoying, especially the maturity, but much of what I've heard indicates that this is a pretty online thing. The game stores and in-person friends who are familiar with 40k don't put up with much of this shit. Well, there was this one time a friend of mine had to sort out some shit because someone in his Discord group, which talked a lot of 40k, was an actual neo-Nazi, or at least a massive edgelord, but that's the only time I can recall such a thing. Talking about this is all kind of lame, but it only comes out one more time in the Iceberg, so let's move on and get a little stupid. There's a common issue in sci-fi where authors seem to not have a good sense of scale, and 40k is absolutely not safe from this. It is often said that the Imperium has 1 million worlds and stretches across the galaxy, a galaxy with at least 100 billion stars. Some of the first given numbers for Terra's population, when Terra has its oceans laid bare and theoretically the entire surface is usable, while it is also true that much of the populace is supposed to be living in overpopulated squalor, were as low as 200 billion. With our current population of 8 billion, with much of it living in countries or regions that are small relative to the surface of the Earth, it's hard to believe that number, so, in recent years, we've gotten numbers reaching into the quadrillions. The largest type of Titan, the Imperator, has heights ranging from 50 meters, or 164 feet, to 100 meters, or 328 feet, and both numbers are still way off with the illustrations given. For the Space Marines, there are supposedly 1,000 chapters, with 1,000 Marines each, for a total of around 1 million Space Marines, which are somehow supposed to make a difference in a gigantic galaxy where there are at least trillions of orcs, tyranids, and chaos worshippers. While that last figure might be a testament to the abilities of the Astartes, this is only scratching the surface of this goofy problem. There's a saying in the community where you should just add a 0 or 2 at the end of a number a 40k book gives you, and things will start to sound about right for a setting that many sell on being over the top. If you ever tried to pre-order some limited edition Warhammer related item, I'm sure you've seen how much is sold out even if you just enter the site as soon as it was updated with new stock. This is especially the case with 40k related items, and even worse with limited runs for Black Library novels, as despite the many efforts on Games Workshop's part, scalpers have set up stuff like bots to put items out of stock before you know it. Items will get resold at up to 5 times their original value, sometimes more, and as long as people keep buying from scalpers, the scalping racket will keep going. Some hobbyists try to get copies of certain items reserved from their local game stores, or at least stick with in-person game stores, but this problem doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. Saint Celestine is a living saint of the Thoritas who's been around since 3rd edition, and Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax is a more recent character who became relevant during the Fall of Cadia, when she was released from Trajan's centuries-long imprisonment. Greyfax was a bit out of time and in a hell of a situation on Cadia, where her Puritanism clashed with what was being put up against the invading forces of chaos, including Saint Celestine, who could be reasonably interpreted as some sort of mutant psyker thing. Fortunately, Greyfax isn't stupid, and was willing to work with Celestine, and both of them were amongst the retinue that accompanied the newly awakened Guilliman on his way back to Terra. The two would meet again in the audio drama Our Martyred Lady, as the two were trying to resolve a Tzeentch-influenced ecclesiarchy fiasco, and this story gave them more time to be something resembling friendly. Now, a lot of this is easy material for people to make romantic ships, and a lot of bits from Our Martyred Lady especially have been interpreted as more fuel to this fire, or so I've heard. It's a bit of a meme with these two, and to be honest, somebody has to do something with them because neither character has been relevant in years. If it keeps these two cool characters in the collective consciousness of 40k fans, then personally so be it. Forge World was a subsidiary for Games Workshop that put out either big fat models or just about all of the minis for the Horus Heresy game alongside the rules for both of those things. These models are generally considerably more expensive, and the rules for the 40k models are published through the Imperial Armor books, which is where things get very interesting. For a bit of a timeline, they had their first run of books between January 2000 and August 2006, though most of these books were just updates. The next run was from January 2003 to October 2014, which is the one most people are thinking of when they're talking about Imperial Armor. Another run from January 2012 to January 2015 would update some of these previous books for 6th and 7th edition, while 2017 brought updated books for 8th edition, and November 2020 brought a single unifying book for all the Imperial Armor rules for 9th edition. Imperial Armor also had some side things, such as the Aeronautica Imperialis game, which was focused around aerial combat, Model Masterclass, which is all about painting, modeling, and working with resin, and Apocalypse, which gave rules for running massive battles with 40k's regular 32mm models. As for that second run from 2003 to 2014, this is the meat of the Imperial Armor sandwich. There are 13 volumes, and I'm going to blitz through them, though I'll give them more focus some other time if they have dedicated entries. Volume 1 focuses on the Imperial Guard, the Imperial Navy, and the tanks they bring to battle, while Volume 2 goes over vehicles for the Space Marines, Inquisition, Grey Knights, and Sisters of Battle. Volume 3 goes over the Taros campaign, a battle between the Tau Empire defending the turncoat world of Taros, and the invading Imperial forces looking to reclaim the planet. Volume 4 takes a look into the Anphelion Project, an inquisitorial research operation dedicated to uncovering weaknesses in the Tyranids. After the site of their research goes dark, an ensemble force of Space Marines, Mechanicus researchers, and guardsmen led by an Inquisitor is gathered to investigate the fate of the Anphelion Project. Volumes 5 through 7 go over the Siege of Rax, which I'll get to in a minute. Volume 8 details the raid on Castaral Novum, in which war boss Garagak captures the aforementioned planet and the surrounding sector, inciting a response from the Imperium. Volumes 9 and 10 explore the Badab War that pitted loyalist Space Marines against one another after Huron of the Astral Claws rebels against the Imperium and rallies other chapters to his side. Volume 11 covers the Batalis campaign, where an alliance of Eldar forces seeks to reclaim the armor of one of their Phoenix Lords, which is unfortunately located on the Imperial world of Batalis III. Volume 12 is all about the Orphean War, as Necrons of the Maonarch dynasty launch a sudden invasion into the Orpheus sector, wiping out any human in their way and bringing on Imperial retaliation. Volume 13 focuses on the vehicles and war machines of the Chaos Legions. Volume 14 is unpublished and will definitely stay that way, but it was to be called Fire of the Thyraxis, and covered a battle between the Mechanicus and Tau. Each of these volumes would feature brand new Forge World miniatures, which would get their rules in the same book, with the minis being of the featured factions, alongside rules for playing scenarios along the lines of the featured story. For example, Volume 3, the Taros campaign, featured minis and rules for Imperial Elysian drop troops and Tau Tetra hovercraft, with a scenario in which the Space Marines strike out one of the Tau missile silos and advance to the main invasion, with the objective being to either plant demolition charges to destroy the silos or to defend those silos. Additionally, while Volume 14 was never published, its associated minis and their rules were. Nowadays, Forge World is dead. And by dead, I mean Forge World has been folded into Games Workshop, so their minis are still sold and supported, while the Horus Heresy game has been in the process of releasing more and more plastic miniatures. While Imperial Armor is far from what it used to be, and the whole volume thing is all but formally discontinued, the love for big minis persists, and they'll probably continue to come out, but just not under the Imperial Armor name, and definitely not under the Forge World name. Okay. This shit is always getting explained in no less than an hour, so I think I'll make this quick. The Siege of Rax was an 18-year military campaign recounted in Imperial Armor Volumes 5, 6, and 7. Once a cardinal of the ecclesiarchy loses himself to his own ambitions of power, his sororitas underguard ratted out his behavior to the Ordo Hereticus, who made a failed assassination attempt against the cardinal. As the cardinal had entrenched himself in the fortress world of Rax, which held all sorts of infrastructure properties of the Departmentum Minatorum, blowing up the planet wasn't in the cards, so a siege was launched with the Adept Corps of Krieg taking charge of this effort to seize the Imperial fortress, the Citadel of Rax. With a mix of zealotry and sitting on a bunch of weapons, the defenders were more than capable of holding their ground, and after several years of battle, and the Death Corps of Kree making substantial gains in their assaults, traitor Marines of the Alpha Legion made contact with the Cardinal to provide their aid. Once word of this got out to the attackers, these reports reached the Dark Angels chapter, who made a little strike, and while they didn't explain much of anything about why they got involved, it was definitely to look for the Fallen. After the Dark Angels pissed off, the Alpha Legion Lord overseeing the siege had turned the Cardinal's brain into traitorous soup, so he called his sorcerers, who sent out a signal calling all the Chaos guys to come on down to Vrax. The orbital fleet trying to keep the siege contained were overrun by the reinforcements, and Vrax was swarmed by hordes of heretics coming in all shapes and sizes. Command of the siege was changed around a bit, with one Marshal Amin Kagori, and bigger guns were brought in to equalize the fight, along with engineer corps that would dig under enemy defenses to wage a war that defenders might be unprepared for. Unfortunately, even with making another major reach into the citadel of Vrax, the Imperial forces were yet to do much more than equalize the fight, and with dwindling faith in the siege not helped by the attackers being behind schedule, the Administratum was beginning to withdraw their support. To maintain their momentum, Marshal Kagori enlisted the help of the Marines of the Red Scorpions chapter. With a decisive strike, the Marines allowed for the Death Corps to pass through a breach in the enemy defenses and continue their assault. Word was going around that shit was getting weird around Vrax, and these rumors reached Hector Rex, an Inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus. Inquisitor Rex had suspected that Vrax was about to be the site of a demonic incursion, and he could no longer stand idly by. The Inquisitor used his authority to take command in the siege, which shoved the Ordo Hereticus aside much to their chagrin. To prepare for the escalation of war, the Inquisitor also brought in his whole chamber, including a few dozen more Inquisitors and all the resources, along with Grey Knights and Marines of the Red Hunters chapter. Unfortunately, an attempt to mobilize some of the Death Corps to encircle the Citadel put them in the way of playing Marines, and the Death Corps don't have internet, so they launched extremely potent chemical weapons against the servants of the Rodfather, which naturally did fuck all, and instead summoned demons. Fortunately, the mobilization ultimately worked, and the Grey Knights took care of the demons, and the encircling of the Citadel sparked a coup in which the Coronates would assume command of the defense. Unfortunately, the Ordo Hereticus is full of a bunch of petty bitches, so they pulled strings on Inquisitor Rex to order the withdrawal of several regiments of the Death Corps, even as victory seemed to be at hand. Putting that sentiment to bed for a moment, the defenders constructed a warp portal, which allowed for more mutants, demon engines, and actual demons to aid them in their last stand. After several assaults into the Citadel, with some utter disasters and others victorious, the siege turned into a massacre against the heretics. With their demonic defenders banished, the Citadel was raided and the Dark Angels pledged their help again to defeat the Alpha Legion Lord, who would then be imprisoned under the Unforgiven's watch. As the Grey Knights made one last attack on the warp portal and destroyed it, the siege was finally at an end. After 18 years, nothing of value was left on Vrax. Perhaps if the siege was called off a few years prior in favor of Exterminatus, it would at least preserve the lives of some of the Imperium's stalwart defenders. The Cardinal was reduced to an impotent chaos spawn, which was promptly incinerated. His Sororitas Honor Guard were imprisoned, retrieved, and after lengthy interrogation, executed due to risk of corruption. The tenacious defense of the Citadel eventually unmade the planet's purpose as an army world, as no useful amount of weapons were left after the siege. So, why do fans care so much about this shit show? Because, with how thorough the coverage of the siege is across the 13 Imperial Armor volumes, it feels equally epic and historical. With how 40k blends the old school styles of everything from knights in shining armor to hardy soldiers holding down the trenches while still bringing in the twisted and fantastical, the Siege of Vrax unifies the ideas and themes of the setting while still feeling grounded as you get a peek into supply chain issues and bureaucratic disasters. Fan art, mockumentary style videos, and many stories have recounted the siege, and while grand new events continue to pull eyes into the present and future, the Siege of Vrax is something the fans of the hobby might recognize as though it were a legend. Well, that's the first 2 tiers for you. This isn't my job, of course, and I'm sorry that this is probably pretty elementary, but I hope someone comes away from this learning something new, or understanding something through a different perspective. There are some 380 something remaining entries, and I'm gonna go focus on that. It might take months, this video took months, but feel free to stay tuned at your own discretion. I've been sending out a bunch of disjointed video ideas, but those will probably wait.